What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Deer Gear Podcast. I'm your host, Cameron Derr, and today I am sitting down with Dorge from Firenock and Dave Murray from Vital Limits. Today's conversation builds off the last time I had these guys on, so if you haven't already, please go back and listen to that conversation. It was all about the fundamentals of aero shafts, and in this conversation, we're talking more about aero shafts, why Firenock developed their own aero shaft, what makes it better than the competition. We're also talking about aero straightness. Is it just marketing jargon, or does it really matter? 0.001 versus 0.006, what's the difference? And much, much more. These guys are super smart and eager to help. So if you guys are having any questions, give us some feedback. Get a hold of me on Instagram, Cam the Cameraman. Get a hold of Dorge. His email is in the description of this podcast. Visit Firenock TV YouTube channel, or however you want to get a hold of us. Please get some questions going, because Dorge and Dave are eager to answer your questions. So without further ado, let's get into today's podcast. All right, everyone, I am back live with Dorge and Dave Murray from Vital Limits and Dorge from Firenock, obviously. If you guys haven't already listened to last week's episode with Dorge, we covered the fundamentals of aero shaft building, and this week we're going to be moving on. So you need to understand last week's conversation to understand this week's conversation, but we have a good one in store for you guys. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing great. This is Dorge with Firenock.
Oh, pretty good. Hanging there. It's Dave from Vital Limits.
It's good to have you guys here today. Dorge, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, today I want to sort of brush into the what is the material that will impact on the carbon fiber tube, which is what the aero tube we're talking about. So I think before we start all this, I need to sort of clarify a few definitions, because I think a lot of people got confused. Because see, when people say, oh, I got carbon aero, it's pretty much the same thing as that I got a stainless steel fork. What does it mean? I mean, you know, you can get a fork in Walmart for like $1.50 for 10, and you can get a good fork for like $40. They're both made of steel. The same thing with the carbon fiber. First of all, hopefully a lot of people are with fishing. So I would just sort of lay out the basic knowledge and basic terminology of carbon fiber. So right on the get-go, the carbon fiber is the basic form is called impregnated carbon fiber. What it is that then we got the word like in the case of fishing, like IM6, IM7, IMX. But in the case of carbon fiber manufacturing, it's pretty much called your 24-ton, your 28-ton, your 32-ton, and your 40-ton. The word ton is implied as the structural, the bending strength that we can exert it on it without bending. I know the word ton is not really used, but because some people it's called million module. So that's the reason the word ton was used quite a bit. So the higher the module or the tonnage of the carbon fiber, the less the material you can use, the lighter it gets, and the stronger the carbon fiber is. Which means that the higher the modulation, the stronger the spine, the also stronger the aero. But there is a trick hook to it. As the carbon modulation goes up, the brittleness of the entire process of the carbon fiber also increases. Now that's on the carbon fiber side. And at the same time, as we move into weave, the weaving process of a carbon fiber have two steps to it. One is the physical weave process. The other is the fiber that you weave process. So basically your 1-to-1 ratio and a 2-to-1 ratio. 90% of the market right now using a 2-to-1 ratio. And that itself because it's cheaper and easier to make. But just can you imagine when you put your two finger between your two fingers, like holding two hands together and you put a finger crossing, you can see there's a lot of gap in between. As the fiber filament diameter increases, when you put two fiber together, like you've got a one fiber, I mean, just use example. Imagine you got a 1 millimeter fiber weaving into a 1 millimeter fiber. Your resulting height is actually closer to 3 or more like a 2.75, 2.8. But as you decreases the fiber's size, what you see, why is this important? It is important because as you imagine from 2 to 2 points, from one piece of fiber or 1 millimeter to the thin finish of 2.75, that 0.75 is resin, which means it add nothing to the strength and add everything to the weight. Now, as we decrease the fiber size and tighten the weave, the amount of ratio of resin will decrease and will increase the strength, reduce the weight, but you also can increase the amount of layers on the same amount of space. Am I helping? So in the case, let me sort of put it back in the summarized terms. On fiber-wise, the higher the K value, the stronger the carbon fiber, supposedly the better the result of the arrow shaft. But you also have to balance with, if you do that too much, the arrow shaft becomes extremely brittle. In the case of the cloth, the lower the K value, the more expensive and better it gets. Okay, I didn't talk about price, but I need to. From 1K to 4K on the carbon fiber, the price is, imagine if 1K is $1, 2K will be $2, 3K will be $4, and 4K will be $8. So it is exponentially go up. In the case of fiber cloth, a 4K cloth, assuming is $2, a 3K cloth will be more like $8, and a 1.5K will be 16, while 1K will be more like 32. So the numbers are very, very dramatic. But unfortunately, is that in the case of making carbon arrow shaft, the amount of material cost is not that much. Because as you imagine, the lighter the arrow, the less material you use, although the price is double, but not really that dramatic. I mean, if you are generally, say, assuming that a normal arrow, say you can get Walmart cost about $1, a 4K fiber, 1K weave arrow will cost about $32. I mean, that's how ridiculous it can get. Okay, I get that out of the way. Because see, until you understand that, we can't talk about carbon fiber construction. Because why didn't you just use 4K, 1K? You can't, because then you may end up with the shaft, 100% 4K, 1K. You may end up with a shaft that will cost you over $1,000 a dozen. Wow. No, I'm serious. It can be that ridiculous.
Would that be the ultimate arrow, though, if price wasn't an issue?
I would say that would be, because that's the best material we can possibly put together. But then you also need to understand in the world's retail market of an arrow shaft. I mean, let me give you a hint of, if you get, say, an arrow about 70 cents in Vietnam, out of Vietnam, or out of, say, China or so on. First of all, there's shipping cost to it. And then a lot of people are not aware, every single arrow that's sold in US is subject to excise tax. That means the US government will automatically put a number. I mean, it doesn't matter the arrow costs $1 or $50. The US government at this moment of January is about 53 cents a piece of tax. So if you think about it, if you get a dozen arrow for $50, right on the get-go, there's $6 of tax on it. That is paid by the manufacturer. It's the first, whoever made it had to pay that. That's called the arrow shaft excise tax. And so people say, oh, I got this dozen arrow for $20. You need to ask yourself this question. If the arrow costs $20 and there's $6 in tax, the guy's making money, how much does it cost to make that arrow?
Right.
But I think a lot of people are not familiar with this fact. So until you understand, right on the get-go, there's tax on it. I mean, the same thing with all your components of every single thing that go on a boat, there's 11% excise tax on it. So people say, well, how come the stuff, just like you buy an AeroRest, there's $100. And if you buy from, say, a manufacturer like myself, I had to pay the US government Treasury Department $11 for the AeroRest that I just sold. And then if you think of retail market and so on in 3 tiers, that can be very significant.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, now I get the basic material fundamental out of the way. At least people know we will have some base on what I'm talking about. Why if you say, well, why not you just go make a 1K, 4K, 1K arrows? Because it can be that expensive. But then when you make something that expensive, the 52, 53 cents based on when the US government come up with the numbers, by the way, that number changed. It used to be 55, 60 cents. Now it's more like 53 cents. So every year on January, we'll look at what the excise tax number is. The 11% on all archery bow equipment do not change.
Now, Dorge, you have 2 different shaft options as far as sport weave and AeroWeave. You want to tell us a little bit about kind of how that came into effect? Why?
Oh, sure.
Perhaps maybe why it took a few years for, say, dealers to urge that to happen.
Well, the reason I make 2 shaft because originally you can imagine I don't want to make anything unless it's the best. The AeroWeave is based on the 2 US patents. Actually, I have 5 US patents originally. I withdraw 3 of them because those 3 are for manufacturing process. And I'm convinced I have no way to build them in US. So it's no point for me to do the manufacturing utility patent. I would just keep it as a trade secret. And the 2 other patent is the process. You can have the product in hand. I can show you that this is how it's made. That's the reason my 2 patents for the AeroWeave is only on the shaft itself. Now, as you remember, last week we talked about the basic carbon shaft started with extrusion, which means the fiber are linear. Then you go into multi-layer directional impregnated roll, which is what 90% of what the aero shaft out there. Imagine the first layer like 15% to the left, the second layer 15% to the right, and then a third layer 15% to the right again, and then do a 30-degree again on the top, and then 5 layers. So by doing so, you blend the direction of the fiber, and you give the arrow loop strength. So that means just in case if you break it, it will not spur like the original first generation carbon fiber. Then you end up with all the sharp pieces coming out. And if you look at any of the pictures on the first generation carbon fiber accidents, that's exactly what that is. And doing a multi-layer, it prevented that, but you create a whole new set of problems. Now, as you recall from last episode, we talked about if you do that, your arrow have a lot of torsion in it. The higher the angle of each of the layer and the resulting layer, the arrow have more torsion. Can you balance it in some way? I think Gold Tip did a really good job. I think Black Eagle do a wonderful job, and there's other company do less good job, and that's the reason the torsion is so bad. But unfortunately, in the aero industry, on the entire archery, nobody understands the word torsion. They just think about bending. They don't think of torsion. And then since the moment I understand how bad torsion is, I have to find a way to counter it. And we can mechanically counter it. That's the reason I was using the carbon weave cloth to counter this. So in other words, if you want to prevent the carbon shaft from having torsion, you need to start on the material side. So I start with the 4K weave to start with. By meaning a weave, that means the first layer. You really think about on the aero weave stuff is 4 layers from center to out. The first layer is a 90-degree, 180-degree weave. That means the fiber are laid longitudinal and loopwise, which means that the moment you flex the arrow can only flex one way, linearly. But the problem is that if you do that, that arrow have no linear strength because the fiber that we put on it, only about a third of it have actual ability of the strength. Because can you imagine, if you lay the carbon fiber cloth at 90 degree, 180 degree, the 90 degree, yes, is indeed the spine of the shaft. But remember, it's going up and down between the carbon fibers. So it's linear structure spine strength. is actually very minimal. But then I also recognize the fact is that on the first generation ultra low strength carbon, the linear from front to back carbon have one very major benefit. It is where the spine of the shaft is. So if I'm able to lay fiber from front to back in a pure linear form and using a higher modulation, that is the layer that I control the spine number of the shaft, isn't it? Now, if you only have these two layers, the moment when the arrow breaks, the fiber is going to come out like a spur again, isn't it? But we also try to control the torsion of the shaft. So what happened is on the third layer, that on the AeroWeave, I actually lay the carbon fiber at 45 degree and 135 degree. So in other words, if you think about it, on the first and third layer, if you look at a cross section, you look like an English flag. So at this moment, when you bend the shaft, using layer 2 as your spine control, the layer 3 is your torsion control, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But since the layer 3 is on the outside, the moment when you bend them, the 45 degree and 135 degree can create issues, because when you bend them, those are at 45 degree, they can crack easily. That means that you lower the loop strength. That's the reason the fourth layer, the outermost layer of the AeroWeave, the fourth layer and the first layer are identical. They are also 90 degree and 180 degree. Now, by doing so, there's a few major downsides. Is that, first of all, the construction is extremely complicated because every single layer has to be precise. Because in the old days, you can be like about 30 degree. Now you have to be 90 degree and 45 degree exact. But then you also have fiber of the 4K weave. The fiber get very thick. The resin between the 1, 3, and 4 layer are actually quite a bit, which now increase the weight of the carbon of the entire arrow shaft. But doing so, you also have one problem. You're dealing with a lot of resin. So the strictness of the arrow become a gigantic question. Because everybody looking for the outside to be something like 1,000. That is the reason the first generation AeroWeave was not very straight. But I thought that I'm using a CNC machine to grind the outside once. I can do better than 1,500, no matter what. Well, I was wrong, because there's so much resin underneath it. As time goes on, the resin, as you bend it, the resin start doing weird stuff. That's the reason back when the first generation AeroWeave, I was floored to find out some, after CNC 1,500 in my hand after 4 months, can be close to 9,000. I was so freaking beside myself. Sorry, there's no better way to say it. I was beside myself. And I learned how to control it and so on. We increased the pressure of the entire rolling process, and finally they got it right. Now, but then also, another thing that a lot of people do not understand when you lay so many layers of the carbon fiber weave in it, weave carbon fiber cloth, there's a huge amount of resin in it, isn't it? How do you control the weight perfectly? You can't. So we have to go through another sorting process. That's the reason when you buy an AeroWeave, every single row have a certain number on it. The number is that all the arrow have been sorted and then so on. I mean, in the case of, say, a normal arrow world, when you buy from, say, Gold Tip, Black Eagle, they're all sorted within 1,000, okay? And when they make those basic cloth shafts, when they say make a shaft is 200 grain out, the entire lot is between 202 grain to 198 grain. The variation may be 5 grains. But in the case of a weave, especially on a 32-inch shaft based on a 250 grain shaft, that lot from our manufacturing process, the variation is closer to 10 grains. That means I need to resort them and then do a 1 grain increment and repackage them.
Wow.
So that's the reason when people buy from us, I always ask my dealer, okay, what grain sort you want?
Yeah.
And of course, people say, oh, this is no good. But then they didn't understand why that is such a big difference, because it's a whole different process.
Right. I have one
Good.
question before we go further.
Mhm.
So you said if you don't want to dive down this rabbit hole, you don't have to, but the reason for your process is to control torsion. And
Yes.
you mentioned that most archers and people in the archery world don't understand what torsion is or what torsion does. So why is torsion bad, or having too much torsion bad? What's the result?
Okay, in the old days, torsion is really not that bad because we don't bend the shaft, we don't demand the shaft so much. But as we increase the speed of the arrow, we increase the compression ratio. Like when we move to, say, a 55% off all the way to 90% off, the compression cycle is so much more dramatic. As it's dramatic, that means that imagine the arrow in the old days just slightly bend and it comes out. But in the case of recurve bow, you bend and then you bend once, it relaxes and it's done. But in case of a compound bow, the entire cycle was very flat. That means side would say 80% off all the way to high power, flattened, and then come down. In the case of recurve, it's high to low. That's it. But when you have so much pressure in such a short time, the shaft is significantly being compressed. The bowing of the shaft is increasing to bow instead of bow once. As it increases to bow, you increase to torque.
Mm-hmm.
And then the heavier you got on the front, the worse it get. The longer the power stroke, the worse it get. The higher the let off, the worse it get. That's the reason torsion becomes such a big deal, because now most people are shooting 80% off. People like to shoot the thin shaft. The people like to shoot the heavy FOC. That is the reason torsion becomes such a big deal. But that is still not a big deal if you shoot low speed enough, the vein is no longer a factor. All the torsion is actually bad if you have veins. Yes, that means if you shoot a shaft with, say, no veins and you have torsion, it actually do not matter. Do you know why?
I don't.
Because the drag factors of the vein. As you imagine, you shoot over 315 feet per second, your drag factor becomes so significant. That's pretty much, you will keep on me talking about that 315 feet per second, because that's where the aerodynamics become become dominant factor.
Okay.
So that's the reason, we talk about torsion, but if you're a guy who's shooting 280 feet per second, the torsion is not going to be that important to you.
Okay.
Because at that moment, even you use AeroWeave, which is aerodynamic vein, it's not going to matter. I'm very glad you point that out, because a lot of people say, well, why does it matter to me? But in most cases, it may not matter to you as long as you do not shoot high speed, as long as you do not shoot heavy FOC, as long as you do not shoot, say, thin shaft. But the fact is that if you don't shoot high speed, all the factor we talk about is minimized.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why a lot of people say, oh, well, you shoot so good, you penetrate so deep and whatever. At that moment, every single thing that we learn in high speed, especially, of course, right now, as you can imagine, a lot of people do not recognize. Over 60% of the archery kill is on crossbows.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when John and they told me that every 10 archery equipment he sold in Pennsylvania when he was with PSE, every 10 of them, 6 of them is crossbow.
Wow.
And people don't recognize it. But remember, crossbow is also not just sold in archery shop. It's sold in finger hut, all kind of a cheaper place. You can get a crossbow for $400-500 on a mail order. Those are your big numbers, because those people are out there and shooting those. But then they don't understand why the thing don't behave. Because the moment you go to crossbow, you can easily pass the 315 feet per second. That's the reason people say archery equipment is not reliable, it's not made for long distance and so on, because this is where we learn how the arrow shaft construction is such a dominant factor. As a matter of fact, I'm going to, depends on how we will, but I can easily see the next 5 episodes. We talk about arrow components and how they impact the performance of arrow. But of course, if you shoot technically under 200 280, 270 feet per second. A lot of stuff we talk about may not even be seen. I mean, just like people say, if you only drive 45, 50 miles per hour, aerodynamic is really not a big deal, isn't it? But imagine you try to go down a highway in a truck at 90 miles per hour, that's a square box.
Yeah.
You're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
So your process is to basically manipulate spine and try and control torsion through construction of the shaft.
All right. It's a physical restraint to control torsion.
Got it.
In other words, we just simply, instead of hoping that the multi-layer directional impregnated carbon will give you a decent spine, we actually engineer the spine to be linear. Well, but like quite a few dealers call me and say, "Dorge, this stuff is great, but the cheapest AeroWeave is $160. Retail at $159.95. What I mean, we like to sell your stuff only. So what happened to the general guy who come in want a decent shaft? Can you do something about it?" I say, I have a rule is that I don't make something that everybody makes that is not 50% better. But they sort of twist my arm really hard. I mean, they really did twist my arm. They say, can you make something just like the others, but make it slightly better? I say slightly. That's a very bad word. I don't do things slightly. So I say, how about this? Since I learned my original fiber construction from one of the top manufacturers, I mean, I know Marvin Carlson, who used to be one of the inventor of gold tip arrows. He was the CEO of gold tip. And I learned about how the carbon fiber process works. How about we just do a gold tip arrow, but we add a 90-degree and 180-degree weave on the outside. So then, in other words, I got a slight torsion control, but I will lower the cost over 50%. And that's the reason. I mean, if the result comes out is decent, you get the load, you get the protection that I wanted. Because the number one problem for 90% of people is that they don't flex before they should. So just in case if the arrow break, it end up with spurs. But with the 4K weave on the outermost layer, if the arrow did break, it will only break where the weave cross is. So it becomes reasonably safe. And at the same time, we also give you a very good look like the AeroWeave. That's the reason I make the sport with. Yes.
And I mean, as far as the price of AeroWeave being in that $160 range and with some of your micros a little bit higher than that, really that's not that. I mean, really it's not that bad because, I don't know what the current price is, but last year when I was looking at like Gold Tip Pro Velocity shafts only, they were in that $170 range just for shafts.
Are you talking dozens really, there?
Yes, a dozen.
Okay.
Just a dozen. So, I mean, really, when you're looking at high-end shafts purchased by the dozen, the AeroWeave is really priced very competitively.
Yeah, what is the AeroWeave price?
$159.95 for the basic 4K. But because of that, I mean, a lot of people, this is the first time 2 years ago, a lot of my customers love the 204. I really think the 204 is one of the best size hunting arrow shaft. I mean, which is where the same size as the Eastern Access. But there's three downsides to it. One of them, you can't use an insert because you have to use a half out or an outsert with it. Of course, outsert doesn't work. So a half out is the answer. But the problem is that with a 204 using a 4K, you are pushing about 11 to 12 frames per inch.
Yeah.
So in order for me to do that, I have to lower the entire, each of the weave have to be lowered. That's the reason I go to a 1.5K and then 1.5K weave 4K fiber, and then go to a true 4K linear fiber on layer 2, 1.5K on layer 3, and 1.5K on layer 4. On the material side, right on the get-go, the price jumped 300% on material. That's the reason the 204 light, which I'm able to get about 8 grains per inch from 12. So that's a third lighter. but I have to increase the price to $219.95, like $220 a dozen. But then so many customers love the 166, which we'll talk about the benefit and downside later in this episode if you guys want, is that 1.5K is not enough. I need to go 4K with it. 1K, in other words, 4K fiber, 1K weave.
Yeah, the 166 shaft should really be talked about with the concept system involved in there, because I think that's going to be the game changer.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, when we go
in the future, when we talk Aero concept, I think the 166 is going to be critical, and so is all the crossbow and the target shaft. But in the 166 case, I'm able to drop them to about 9 grain per inch on the 166 size. Of course, if you're doing extrusion, now see, this is problem is that a lot of people even make really, really cheap 166. Do you know why? And be reliable. Because when you extrude or when you do super thick layer of 166, just pounding on it, the chance of it breaking is pretty low, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because the wall is thick. So you can technically do an extrusion of 166 and be cheap and be durable and not have that much accident.
That's the only problem with that is the wall thickness plays a factor in downrange as far as recovery.
Well, definitely. But in some cases, the extruded 166 on a true 1-to-1 performance ratio, they're actually better. That means the cheapest 166 will actually perform better for most people. It just don't have longevity. And the breakdown of resin will kick into play.
So I'm shooting a 166 Aero that has, and this is like marketing terminology, thick wall technology. And
that's definitely marketing.
Yeah, I paid $174 a dozen for those shafts. So I feel like your price point, and that's at 11.2 grains per inch on a 166.
Right. Just put it this way: to make 166 lightweight, there's two ways to do it. You either go 100% linear, and hopefully the thick enough wall will not cause it to break. The other way you can do it is that you go ahead and make it as thick as possible so that the cheaper material can be used. So the moment you 166 with expensive material, you really get expensive fast. Mm-hmm. That's the reason when you look at a Carbon Express medallion, those are $600 a dozen. Mm-hmm. Those are raw shafts. We haven't got a point vein or anything on it. Those are
I've been trying to steer the some of the vertical bow shooters who have the 166 mentality, who shoot high let-off bows towards like the SportWeave 300 and use that into a build because the wall thickness cuts down, and that's a great shaft to use, in terms of recovery. And I've had guys blow through deer with that shaft with vertical bows. And I think that's a huge price point, for guys stepping into a target shaft versus, also having a hunting shaft. Because a lot of guys, and I think this is where the concept system is going to come in. It probably has to be a whole podcast in itself.
Of course, it has to be.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of inseparable.
Well, I understand that, but I try to go with the fundamental of the individual component first, because if we jump into actually I think it would not be bad when we move to 168. We'll recap some of what we talk about today, but you need to understand each individual step first before you can talk about it. Because if you don't know that, say, why do you even bother with torsion? What is the impact? Why is it important? Well, unfortunately, the general archery public really do not care about a lot of that, because first of all, they don't shoot far. Second, they don't really know what's going on. They sound like, well, I got my penetration. Then the next thing you ask yourself, are you sure you mean penetration? What do you really understand what penetration to target means? It was quite funny. I mean, I have to help say this out. The guy told me he got fantastic penetration with a 166. I say, with his 90% let-off bow. I say, do you recognize any time you shoot a target under 23 or 24 yards, your arrow is sitting in target at an angle? A lot of people do not recognize it. But if you shoot the same weight arrow in the 300 size, even at 18 yards, the arrow is straight into the target, not at an angle.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing we want to take. Like this reason, I want to sort of add the arrow diameter difference and what benefit and downside you get out of it. So why not everybody just make one size and be done with it? Because each of the size of the arrow shaft, technically all arrow shafts have the same amount of carbon in it. Then you sort of tweak the carbon, the tonnage, which is the K value, and the weave value, and the direction. That's where it's sort of like just because you can write English doesn't mean you can make a novel. That's where the art of building come in to play. And in most cases, what you want to deal with is balance. The better you do the balance, the better the product. I mean, just like lightweight is great, but it can be dangerous. Weight is fantastic, but you drop too fast. Diameter shaft, the larger it gets, the stronger the shaft by basic two principles. But the thinner it gets, the more durable it gets because the wall is thick.
Well, that's some of the reason why like crossbows use, larger diameter shaft versus when you start to get in a high speed, not everybody's micro.
Right. I mean, just like 2 years ago, Bayonet come with a 204 shaft. But have you looked at the wall size of those? Those are technically like a 204 with a 250 spine, or actually 200 spine. So the final OD is no different than, say, the 246, 200. Because the end of the day, no matter what size diameter you got, the amount of carbon fiber to maintain the spine rating of the shaft is the same. Now, the question is that what is your loop strength? What is your spine strength? What is your weight? And finally, as the arrow travels, what is the torsion behavior of the shaft?
Now, torsion is going to be basically, if I'm understanding this correctly, when the shafts have torsion, it's kind of energy loss from another side of the coin other than flexing.
Correct. Not just that. Because if you don't use a vane, torsion really has very little effect. Because as the shaft torque, the point is pulling it forward. But the moment you torque, the vane is going back left, right, left, right, left, right on every single cycle it goes.
Now, when it torques and flexes, what happens to the internal shape of the shaft that plays a part in energy? Is it kind of oblong like a pear? Is it more circular form? Is there anything like that?
It's actually oblong like a pear. One side is that's a good way to say it. It's more like an egg when you look at the cross section. But then the thicker the shaft, the more you prevent that from happening. That's the reason. But then when you go cheap on making manufacturing process on the linear shaft, the torsion now have nothing to prevent it from torquing, isn't it? Because there's no sideways or a circular restriction for the shaft to torque. So which means that
so your shaft through your construction in an ideal world prevents the pear-like shape from happening internally and retains more energy.
Correct. That's exactly a very good word you said. The whole process of doing it is the more energy that you control the way that you want to expand it, the less the unnecessary effect that you do not want to happen, which is also spending energy.
So despite feet per second, just based on pure construction of the shaft, the way you do it, you're going to look to retain, your arrow down range is looking to retain and hold more energy because it's expensing energy while maintaining the integrity of the shaft.
Thank you. That's exactly the point. Thank you for pointing it out that way. But then we also have to understand as the arrow flexes and torquing, we have veins on it, isn't it?
Yeah, because as the veins are going to be fighting the head and everything else. Not even coming into what the boat's involving into it.
But then remember, the slower the bow, the less effect on the vane.
But nobody has slow bows now because everybody shoots the fastest bow made by the manufacturer, right? That's the mentality.
But then actually they all shooting slow bow now. You know why? Because see, the moment they got a brand new 335 feet per second bow, they go ahead and throw, say, a 100 grain insert, 150 grain point on it. So what does that mean? The arrow weight from the 350 now you look at 500. So how did a bow that's supposed to shoot 335 feet per second with a 500 grain arrow? What do you think the speed is going to be?
270.
I would tell you it's under 270.
Right.
So in other words, you are not shooting anything newer. The bow that you bought in late 1990s will have the same speed as the bow you have now. The only thing is that my bow shoots 335. If you shoot a 350 grain arrow, but you're shooting a 500 grain arrow.
I think the issues are like you said before, more significant when we talk about the newer bows. Some of these bows I think have like 90% let off plus, and it's got to go through this draw force curve that is really adding an inconsistency, potentially downrange to the arrow because it doesn't have a smooth. The more let off, the cycle is not as smooth.
I mean, I remember I talked to quite a few bow engineers. They all told me straight out, the best arrow is somewhere between 5.1 to 5.2 grain per inch.
Wow.
If you use today's best bow with the highest performance, let me explain the word performance in my terms. The fact is that we find out on a 166 shaft, 30-inch draw, 80% let off at 60 yards with basic standard everything, 12 grain, 12% FOC, the whole deal. At 60 yards, you can lose as much as 38% energy off the shaft.
Jeez.
If you shoot a 55% off, the number is 18.
Now this becomes critical because when we start talking your shaft with your arrow components, these are percentages that you put back into the bow for the shooter. Because I get asked the question all the time, well, what does this do for me? And you explain this, they don't get that, and then you say, well, in short, what does it do? What does it do for me? Well, I said on the minimum side, you're probably looking at about 10 to 20% more efficiency in the arrow downrange. Plus,
well, actually,
you can be more than that.
Well, the best I ever done, I do one of my absolute, I would say, king of vertical bow arrow builder at this moment, because what he have done will be Jerry Martin out of Extreme Custom. His arrow at 60 yards, they're using everything I know of, lost less than 5% energy.
Oh my God.
Well, I built one arrow that when I did it in early testing, which was actually with your 2.0 system, I built based on a cheetah arrow that, we didn't have AeroWeave back then, but based on that arrow, I was 9.5% feet loss in feet per second at 50 yards.
Right.
It started out at, I think, 310 feet and was something 281 or 289 at 50. I forget the numbers off my head, but I called up Rick McKinney from Carbon Tech, and I started questioning. I said, well, what am I supposed to lose, like percentage wise, some say 30 yards? And he's like, well, you could be as much as 20 or 30%. I said, well, I lost like 9.5 at 50. And then I started talking to him about the build and the concept system. So it was an interesting conversation, but as soon as you implement the concept system, with the vanes, everything is just wow.
Well, this is where the problem is. You see, everybody, I know the crossbow wheel better now, because first of all, you shouldn't. Right now, we like lately, you got 3 bows out there shooting over 500 feet per second, which aerodynamic now is super king. The shaft performance is super king. The nut is needed to be a whole different ball game. 2022 to 2023, you're going to see a whole new stuff that I come up with because of the demand of those 500 feet per second bow. But then what you're really looking at is loss of energy of the shaft. If you shoot a lightweight shaft with the wrong spine, the vane drag is going to be so critical because your speed is so high. Aerodynamic now take precedence over everything. So if you have a bad vane, say 2.5 degree helical, say on a Raven Aero and shooting 400 feet per second and using a weaker spine, you can lose up to 45% energy at 100 yards.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes exceed more than half. That means if you
people
got
don't realize
180,
that
so speed is not the key. Sorry.
No, like along with that, when you have, I mean, just simply said that it's based on poor recovery of the shafts is why we're losing so much energy downrange. But at the other end of the ball game, when the shaft is flexing, the point changes direction. It's like trying to hammer a nail directly into the wood. It goes right in, but a little bit off, you're going to smash your thumb. The nail doesn't go anywhere.
Well, actually, that was another problem. You said I will try to give you a preview on another episode. We'll talk about titanium. We are talking about microflex now, because see, the moment you have steel and you have microflexes, you don't think of the basic harmonic oscillation process of the shaft. There's also microflex on the shaft because of the vibration giving up by the bow. That's a whole different ballgame that I discovered. That's the reason, if you look at Firenock, we got an entire titanium system just because of that discovery.
So we're getting a little off track, so I want to dial it back.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
we're almost 50 minutes into the recording, so I want to dial it back. I think we need to cover the benefits of your shafts compared to the competition. Oh,
absolutely. As Dave already said, that first of all, our shaft have that capability, and because of the 4-layer construction, that also prevented microflex. That's the reason I bring that in, because see, the layer 3, which is 45 and 135 degree, when microflex come into play, that layer control the microflex. Mm-hmm. That's the reason I bring that in, because see, I was ready to bring back in. You said, because every single layer that I put in it has a reason. The first layer is give you the base foundation. The second layer is give you the spine string. The third layer is prevent torsion. The third layer is most important for 2 reasons. One of them is prevent microflex. And the second reason for that is that you prevent the torsion. And the final wrapping of the outside, you give you the ultimate loop string and also accident prevention. Just like if you really, really hold an AeroWeave shaft and you bend it all the way until it breaks, it don't break in 1 pieces. It bring in 5 to 9 pieces, chunks. In other words, it really behaves like tempered glass. Just like if you break a normal glass, you got spur everywhere. But when you break a tempered glass, you got small cubes. AeroWeave will break like that when it happens. Unless you got crushed. Then you just break on the crush point with clean cut. Which is really...
I think it's important to note that, talking just in relation to shafts, and I try and tell my customers this all the time. I'll have customers that just want to buy vanes like AeroVane 3s and put them on a basic shaft with an insert, and it doesn't work. That we got to approach this thing as a whole system.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, while shafts have different perks, some can be lighter, some can be heavier. You look at the AeroWeave, which I looked at as encompassing an overall aspect of durability, strength, linear spine, all that. When you implement the components into that concept system, AeroVane 3, when we start talking about gyroscopic precession, it's probably going to be in later videos, all that really enhances the shaft. So I think it's important that the listeners don't assume that, they can gain 30 or 40% more efficiency just by getting a shaft or just by getting vanes. In some cases, just putting an AeroVane 3 on a basic shaft can actually work backwards.
Absolutely.
And decrease it because you have a shaft that is not designed that well. It only has a basic insert versus a concept system. And they figure, oh man, it doesn't perform like you said it does. That's why I really don't even get into, selling vanes for people who tell me that they want to do that.
Well, actually, I'll tell you another bad thing about if you do not understand and did not get a good dealer or have no basic idea, you buy Aero, say you go ahead and get yourself a set of AeroWeave, and you build it the way you want, I will guarantee you that is the worst set of Aero you ever use. Because see, remember, now the spine is linear. And if you do not align the spine correctly, that is going to exaggerate significantly on an 80% of any high level ball. So your arrow, every arrow hitting the different spots because you're not aligning them, because the spine is absolute.
Right. And then there's not only speed of the arrow as far as launch people are talking, but when you start implementing arrow vanes, now speed comes into play with high rotational flight. We got speed coming at it in circular from the other end. I mean, which now we really want a shaft that's going to have more torsion control. We want a shaft that has concept system into it. You know, I myself, I mean, it's you know, controversial, but I've had shooters, you know, shoot deer with confidence at 100+ yards. Everything from big mule deer to whitetail shots on elk at 50, 60. I mean, it's pretty astonishing to what can be achieved when you're working with an entire system.
Well, for long distance shoots and so on, I think I'm going to bring in the guy from Double A Archery out of Southern Illinois. His customers have shooting deer at 120, 130 on vertical bows, which most people don't even possible. But that's what he builds. Because on those places when you have a lot of planes, and just like my dealer out of Screaming Eagle and also a Full Curl Archery out of Alaska, anything under 75 yards is considered chip shot. So let's bring it back to final version. I want to talk about AeroWeave. In other words, I did everything I could in it, but on the first build, don't try to do it on your own. Get yourself a good dealer, because you're dealing with an ultra high performance piece. Every mistake you make with this shaft will exaggerate.
Yeah.
Because in other words, I'm exploiting every single benefit. But if you just slap it together, there's no more benefit. There's downside, because every single thing that you think you do not want will actually show up.
Right. Many of the people, well, I find, I would say my most evident mistake that I get from shooters or that they're not informed, you know, we'll get into this in other podcasts, is when they buy these arrows that they don't have the knowledge that the knock is critical to the fit of the serving, which plays in the part with everything. You know,
absolutely.
The knock is like the tires on the NASCAR.
Yeah, but we will talk about that in a whole different episode. I think people will love it. I think the next episode we're going to talk about is just not the inserts. But yes, but remember, we need to talk about how the shaft itself has such big, because it's like, I would say one of my best friends owned a pizza shop told me, until you know what flour is, there ain't going to get no good pizza.
Right. Well, with your shaft, with it being linear spine, technically you're building the shaft to only have one spine. I mean, in an ideal world,
yes,
versus some of these shafts can have 2 or 3 spines that present a problem, because, you know, when you have that, you can get into a whole other area of calling, because you can't, you know, how do you dictate and control the second or thirdary bending points and match them up? I mean, you'd have to get into measuring the shaft on distance that they're spaced apart to get them. I mean, it adds a whole other element that would drive up the cost.
Well, that's exactly where the components and the spine location process come in. So technically, if you want to use AeroWeave, the the minimum requirement is that you get yourself a decent dealer, and you have at least a spine first dynamic bend spine locator system. Otherwise, this will be totally sort of pointless.
Right.
Because it's like trying to buy yourself a best set of tires, but you didn't balance it. You just slapped the tires onto the car. What do you think it's going to do? It will be the worst set of tires you've ever driven. That is a guarantee. And what I want anybody listening to get out of this thing is that, yes, the moment you want performance, The moment you want to go over that 315 feet per second, everything we talk about matters. The higher the let off, the more it matters. And the moment when we're going to be 2 episodes from now, we talk about veins, you'll see how critical it gets. I do have some numbers with the help of Professor Salek, because we do a lot of aerodynamic testings and what kind of implication, because back then, the Olympic gold medalist Rod White helped me a lot of the vein impact. That spectacular test in 2014 and 13. So this reports and these records are close to 9 years old. So I'm going to share this with you because I don't think a lot of people even know it exists. And yes, I'm before I close out for this day, I'm going to tell people that the end of this month, we're going to spend close to 2 weeks using a DARPA radar testing, because we want to put out hard numbers. That means when you shoot an arrow with high let off, medium let off, low let off, high FOC, medium FOC, low FOC, with blaze of AeroWing 2, AeroWing 3, what is the arrow speed? Because with the DARPA radar system, I can now track 20, 30, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. That means when arrow fly by, I got 5 numbers.
I can't wait for that.
So, yeah, because see, I don't think a lot of people understand, just because you shoot something fast now. I say, oh, I got 315 feet per second out of the bow. What's the speed at 30 yards?
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Because the moment, me working with crossbow companies so much, a 60-yard point, the variation on a perfect build, like gyroscopic high FOC, fully harmonic cancellation process, you can lose as little as 1%.
Wow.
But you can also lose as much as 45% energy.
Which is a lot.
But then in the crossbow world, if you got 200 KE, so you lost 45, you still have 110.
Yeah.
See, that's where the problem that people don't think those. I mean, just like when you do got 5 feet per second, my first take of it is that right on the get-go, and you're going to lose 40% energy at 60 yards.
Yeah.
In crossbow world, I know I had guys, give me feedback and shoot this, but I build a lot of stuff for like Raven shooters. That I had one guy out of Delaware who shot a 462 grain arrow, left the bow at 382 feet per second. This is based on 400 foot per second bow, and his 100-yard chrono still was almost 330. I think it was like 328 or 329, which is yielding 110 pound of KE. And when I seen another guy post, I believe it was on Crossbow Nation, he posted something like it was either a 400 or 420 grain arrow, but at 100 yards, it was, if I recall right, like 30 feet per second slower. Well, why? Why is the lighter arrow that's shooting faster losing at 100 yards, 20, 30 feet per second over a heavier weight arrow? I mean, that initially blows people's minds when it's, everybody thinks the lighter arrow should be shooting faster. When we come to the conclusion, and I can make I can make this heavier arrow produce downrange. I mean, that's a whole other ball game when you start involving the concept system on that. And just, it was awesome feedback. I mean, literally shot like a half-inch group at 100. What it doing?
Yeah. Well, and I want to say, since we're going to close this thing right now, I will add another portion to the reason I also make sport weave, because main reason I make the sport weave, because I found out the entire aero market, everybody is looking for super lightweight shaft. The sport weave, because of the way I construct it, I actually intentionally make it the heaviest weight in shaft, not in components. Because see, a lot of people like to put a huge amount of weight in the front, but then they are weakening the entire arrow as a whole. But using a heavier shaft, just like Dave just talked about, you actually get better retaining of energy. And that's the reason, if you want to build something in that category, which is multi-directional layer impregnated carbon, the heavier weight one is better. And that's the reason, when I talked to Rick McKinney about the cheetah over the rhino is a much better hunting shaft than the cheetah. for that exact reason: penetration, energy retaining, and so on. But we are talking back in the early 1990s. Oh gosh, I'm getting old.
I want to touch on one thing too. We have this in our notes. I don't think if you talked about it, I missed it. But when you look at the AeroWeave on Firenock.com, you start looking at the specs. You don't list a shaft straightness, and you wanted to talk about myth busting shaft straightness and.
Absolutely.
I need to personally understand this.
Okay, good. First of all, let me start with the first question. When you shoot an arrow, when the arrow is flight, when is the arrow ever straight?
Just when it's on the arrow rest.
And when it hit the target and finished. Yeah. So anybody know if on a 65% off, on a correctly spined arrow, that's going to be 50,000 flags in the entire arrow flight. If you do 80% off on a correct spine arrow, it's going to be closer to 70 to 80,000. If you increase the FOC, that oscillation cycle number goes up higher. Every cycle that it flexes, energy is used. Now you know why the thinner the shaft, the higher the let off, the more energy you lost in the process. Can we skewer the equation? Yes, absolutely. By increasing the total arrow weight, that increase the momentum. The total energy loss in flex will be decreased because it's not as significant. In other words, you talk about ratios. The ratio of loss is going to be less because it's heavier. That's exactly why. Yes.
I would say a lot of people that, are going for straightness when, the predictability, the accuracy, the consistency between arrows comes within us building to the dynamic bend of the shaft, which we've mentioned several times. This podcast mentioned, and there we talked about briefly the PAP system, but when we locate the spine and we get that across the batch of the arrows, there's where your consistency comes into grouping. Although we don't like to group arrows, although that's what I tell my customers all the time. Don't group the arrows, you could break them. I said, but now that I said this, if you want to support the shop, have at it.
Well, that's exactly really right. But then we need to understand in today's arrow world, we also have to deal with the fact is that every arrow have memories. The memory as defined as that as you flex the arrow and you do not go by the first dynamic band, you create the secondary band, which can be override the first dynamic band. That's the reason, in my opinion, and based on my research, the best arrow are about 3,000 straightness.
So if we get a 3,000 to 5,000 arrow, like you're saying, the mistake of the arrow works in our advantage because we get better memory out of it versus the 001 is more susceptible to, let's just say, change.
Correct. And that's the reason a lot of people say, oh, I shoot this batch of arrow, every one of them for, say, 75 times. Some arrows shoot better than others. What actually happened is that the memory effect kicked in and the first dynamic band moved. That's the reason I told people, you really enjoy your shaft. Some companies' manufacturing process will mitigate this more, but some won't. And also from different sizes of shaft, like the 166 will actually have more of this effect over the 300 size. But if you use a higher modulation carbon, this is less in larger size compared to smaller size. So everything is conditional, and it's not single condition, it's multi-conditional. And until you understand all this, when people say, oh, I know, this arrow company is great. People don't understand it's great for a certain size, not all sizes.
I think I may have mentioned this in an earlier podcast, I'm not sure. But like when you first sent me the first trials of AeroWeave shaft, those shafts were, something like 8 to 13 thousandths. I mean, they were. I mean, by no means everybody would have criticized them, checking the straightness. But when I built them, I spine located them, right? I produced a 2¼ inch group at over 92 yards from a vertical bow, which, for me being a hunter, average shooter type hunter class setup, that was, I would shoot 2-inch groups at 70, 2-inch groups at, 50 with them. Just remarkable, the consistency. At that point is when I realized, you know what, this 001 stuff, that's basically a marketing get up. I mean, if you want to crack an extra $15, $20 on a dozen to make yourself feel better, that's about what you're doing. That's some of the reason why I don't advertise straightness.
I won't knock people for doing that, because I remember my very good original conversation with Marvin Towston, which is the original owner of Gold Tip. I say, Marvin, why do you make the 001, 003, 007, 5, and 010? What are they? I say, they are all 100% identical. You say, why? Then if we sort them by straightness, we got different price points arrows. But then if you know how to build it, which is one of the, I think the industry as a whole really do not want to tell anybody this. The strictness of the arrow in today's compound bow, the reason that people are strictness because that is where you think of consistency. But with a higher the let-off, the consistency is not in the weight. The consistency is in the first dynamic band and the spine. Just like the one of the guy who won the most medal in archery, Rick Bikini, will tell you, the spine is everything. Mm-hmm. The weight is not even as critical as the spine. And some people are so critical on weight. We find out that, yes, weight will have an impact, I would say within 0.5%, even up to 1%, you're not going to feel the difference. As a matter of fact, if most people who build the arrows, go measure 1,000 blazers and tell me the variance. And I will leave it at that.
Yeah.
I think that's good. That cleared up the when I was looking at the notes, and I know we talked about it a little bit on the last podcast about how straightness is even measured is a little bit misconceiving. So thank you for clearing that up. Is there anything else you guys want to add to this?
No, I think this will be wonderful. I want to add this part to it. Well, if you want to look at all the video that Dave was talking about, go to vitallimit.com. At the same time, we at Firenock with very gracious from Cameron, we are allowed to get our audio file, and then we actually started a YouTube channel called the Firenock Podcast. The reason we do that is because we need a way for you to ask questions, and we need a way to answer questions permanently. So every single podcast that Cameron make, we will now relist that on Firenock Podcast channel. I would say it should be up by now, but I don't know because my web manager is working on it. So when it's up, you will be there. So that all questions that you have, because we find out a lot of people can't find a way to ask me. They email me, they call me. But I think if they ask me, I would like the question to be on that page so everybody can see it. As time goes on, that YouTube Firenock Podcast page, we have all the podcasts, all the questions, all the answers. So we can refer back to it. Because see, I don't think like Apple Podcasts allow you to add comments per episode.
No.
So this will give you a way out, which I think will really benefit to all of us.